Hey everybody, in this video Arcade Dog Finn is going to be joining me and showing us how to hand place a few of the components and put the boards in a reflow oven where the actually soldering takes place. In the first video we saw preparing the boards and using a solder paste spreader to put solder paste on the boards and then attach the components to the board with a pick and place machine. And today we're just going to do the next two steps, which is hand placing the big components and using the reflow oven to actually solder the components. So hope you enjoy this video, and Arcade Dog Finn is excited to have you here. Okay, this is the part where we take a board that we just ran through the pick and place machine, and we are going to put on a couple of components by hand on this board that I don't have the pick and place machine doing. The pick and place machine could definitely do with them, but I just found that it's pretty simple for me to place the components. And there's three components we have to place by hand. One is the USB plug that goes right there. The other one is the micro SD card jack that goes right there, and the other one is the ESP32 that goes in this big spot here. But otherwise everything else is in pretty good. Take a closer look at it under the magnifying glass and perhaps make a couple little adjustments if we need to. This USB controller for some reason oftentimes comes a little crooked. In fact, it looks like several of the components are a little bit off. I'm not sure why. Perhaps it's temperature difference that we have out here compared to what it was when I set the machine up. And I noticed that they are slightly off in a few places, but they're easy to adjust. And they don't have to be perfect because typically these things will move and be put in the right spot. The solder kind of sucks them into the right place. So typically you don't have to worry about them being just slightly off. But I'm going to like to make sure that they're all as close as possible. That way that when we pull them out of the reflow oven, the components are connected in the right locations, and I don't have to go through and hand fix any problems that may have arose out of them being slightly skewed. But we just kind of place these little guys in just the right spots. Get the ESP in here. And again, doing this with the pick and place machine has saved a great deal of time putting this board together. There's 20 some odd components on this side of this board, so it's quite time consuming to place every single one of those. And when you're older like I am, it's not often an easy thing to do, placing these components that are half the grain of rice. So we generally do 3 at a time because 3 tend to fit in the oven pretty well. Just moved over, and there is a pad. You'll see me wiping this off. There's a switch that goes down here, and the stencil unfortunately has the holes cut out for where the switch is, but we can't put the switch in the reflow oven or the switch will melt. It is a plastic switch. One of these days I'm just going to put a piece of tape over the section of the stencil and stop having to wipe that by hand. But for now, you can just wipe it off by hand. It gets the solder paste off of that spot because we don't need it there. There's definitely a little bit of an issue with solder, I believe, in that one spot. And this is a little transistor. Yeah, that little transistor is not getting the solder it needs. So we're going to have to fix those by hand. Before we put it in the oven, we want to make sure that it is correctly attached to the board. Sometimes my tools get a little sticky with solder, so you just got to clean those off like this. And in order to fix that, we get our little syringe that has some solder in it and place a very small dab there. And again, it is kind of chilly out here in the garage, so this solder paste is a little slow at flowing. Let me just move that. Let's get these out of the way so we don't screw up what we've already done, kind of like what we just did here. Oh boy. This board just had several pieces get knocked out of the way, and you can tell it's not too hard to do something like I just did, which is get my big fingers in the way and move components from where they're placed. Let's move them back. Not too hard to fix. And we're going to get a little bit of solder paste and put it down here where this transistor goes. ever so slightly. This transistor is extremely small, and it does not take a lot of solder to make it stick to the board where it's supposed to stick. So let's make sure we get the transistor in proper orientation. Just place it down on top of that blob of solder paste. Move over the things that we kind of nudged when we had that accident. And that board looks good to go. So we're going to do this a few more times. I generally like to put 3 of them in the oven at one time. They fit quite well with 3, and let's get as much in there as we possibly can in the oven to get as many boards done at once. That's the idea of all this automation and not doing them by hand, is to try to do multiple batches at one time. But I'll tell you what, it takes a little bit of practice to learn how much solder paste is enough solder paste and how much solder paste is too much solder paste. When you get too much on there, it tends to bridge the connections, and when you bridge the connections, you got to go back afterwards with the soldering iron and fix the bridged connections. So the more time you spend up front working on these, the better off you're going to be. The less repair work you have to do when you're finished with it, if you can get that all in the right places with the right amount of solder on it, and not too much solder, of course not too little solder. I want to make sure the connections are being made and the electrical contacts are being made where they need to be. TSP on there, fine tune a couple of these. Yeah, I really think the cold is affecting the placement of these things. I know it's affecting the solder paste. The solder paste is really thick and not flowing right now, which to a certain extent is good. You don't want it flowing, but there's also a point where it's just too thick as well. That transistor looks like it got the paste on it, so we're going to leave that one alone. Bump this a little. You know, if you've never watched solder reflow, it's just pretty mind-boggling to watch these little tiny components get sucked into the right spot because the solder wicks into the right place and glues the component down correctly. It's pretty cool to watch with a hot air gun when you first do it. And we'll finish our third board here. Wipe off that little bit of excess solder. I think before we do any more, I'm going to clean the silk screen again, because it seems like it's having some problems, especially around the transistor where the slits in the silk screen, or in the stencil, are just so thin. It doesn't take much for the solder paste not to go through there, and you kind of got to have solder paste on there if you want the connections to work correctly. So I think when these go in the oven, I'm going to spend a little bit of time and clean out the paste machine, just to make sure we're getting enough solder on these boards. But that looks good, and we've got 3 boards ready to go. We'll put those in the oven next. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take these boards that we've got the components all installed on and put it in the reflow oven. And what this does is it brings the temperature up at a controlled rate to the melting point of the solder and makes all the solder connections for all these little components that the pick and place machine put on that we put on by hand. It takes about 7 minutes. Kind of varies how many you can get in the oven at a time. I feel that 3 is a pretty good number to have in there to get the heat evenly distributed and to make sure not any of the boards don't get less temperature than it needs to melt the solder. So we're going to put that in the reflow oven and turn it on, and in 7 minutes we'll have hopefully attached components to our FujiNet PC boards. So here you can see on the screen, this is the temperature curve for this particular program that I have in there, and you can see the little X's that it's plotting as it hits that curve. So it does track pretty well onto that temperature curve. I know when I looked at this, a lot of people had negative things to say about it, but to be honest with you, it's worked very well. I haven't done any of the modifications that you can find online for the T962, and it's hitting the target temperatures every time consistently. So in my opinion, this is a great reflow oven for the price. And now you can see it's already reached the maximum temperature and it's starting to cool back down again. So the component should be set in the solder, and now it's slowly bringing the temperature back down for the solder to solidify again. So we should be almost there. It's at 5 minutes and 57 seconds now. Should be about 2 more minutes and we'll be done with those 3 rolls. Okay, and the beep tells us that it is finished its cycle. It took 7 minutes and 13 seconds, roughly. So we stop it. And since it's kind of cold out here today, I will probably let that sit in the oven for just a little bit, maybe crack it open a little bit, because I don't want it to shock. I don't want the cold air to hit that nice hot board and shock the pieces off. So we'll let that sit for a minute. Actually, let's take a little peek. There's a little peek. And those guys should be good to go. So let those cool off for just a minute, and then we'll put it over on the bench and we'll take a look at the components to make sure that none of them have moved and need to be adjusted with a soldering iron. And once we're happy with that, we'll flip them over and attach the LEDs to the back side of that board. Actually, I guess that's the front side of the board. These are the back sides. But we'll see you on the next step when we put the LCDs on there, or LEDs, excuse me, unless we find some problems with these components. And if I find any components, then I'll show you guys what we do to fix those. But stay tuned. Well, that's it for part 2, you guys. I hope you liked this video. Please comment below what you liked, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see us do. I hope you like and subscribe. That would really help us out. We're a new channel, so all the help we can get would be much appreciated. Arcade Dog Finn would really like a subscribe. So in the next video, we're going to install some of the through-hole components and then possibly flash the device to make sure that the FujiNets are functional. And we'll see how far we get in the next one. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you soon.